Lewis D. Hastings, the man who wanted to murder an entire town. Hello, I'm Brent, and this is Strange Embers. Welcome back, everybody. Tonight I want to talk about a man named Lewis D. Hastings. He wanted to kill an entire town in Alaska. This is a not as well known of a case, I would say. I wanted to try to find some cases that people hadn't heard too much about. I know most of the ones I've done are more known killers, and I want to dive into some of these that people don't normally hear about. So as always, let's kind of start back more of where Lewis is from. Lewis was born in Leawood, Kansas on January the 4th of 1944. It's said that his father had came home from World War II and was psychologically abusive to him and his family. He later left his family, and according to his mother and sister, Lewis was a shy child, and as a youth he was treated for chronic depression. Though he grew up to become a caring and gentle adult who loves animals. After he was done with school, he served in the United States Air Force and then later became a computer programmer and began to work in his profession at Stanford University in around 1975. His colleagues described him as an introverted person who didn't talk much and was excessively worried about his personal safety. They also stated that he had a very high opinion of the work that he did, although that a lot of them said that his programming work and skills were only mediocre at best. Now, moving on from there to talk a little bit about Alaska and the place all this took place at. It's a small town in Alaska called McCarthy and another one called Kennecott. These places have a major temperature fluctuation between 50 degrees below zero in the winter to up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. And the snowfall can average up to 52 inches. At almost 230 miles east of Anchorage, Alaska, McCarthy and Kennecott are located in the middle of the Wrangell St. Ellis National Park and Preserve. It was established in 1980. This national park encompasses an area roughly the size of West Virginia, and it's about 6 times the size of the Yellowstone National Park. There are 4 major mountain ranges that converge in the park, and 9 of the 16 tallest peaks in the United States come from within this park's boundaries. And unlike most national parks, the land along the McCarthy Road and along the road from the McCarthy to Kennecott is just a mix of private roads and public roads, and more than 1 million acres within the park's boundaries are still privately owned. So near the turn of the 20th century, in the ridges above the Kennecott, there were prospectors that discovered some of the richest concentration of copper ever unearthed. This prompted the creation of Kennecott. It was a blue-collar company town, and then from there, McCarthy was made, and it was its red light sister, they called it. But by the 1930s, most of the ore had been depleted, and the copper prices had plummeted down. So the mines began to close, and the companies began to close as well, along with the town. So the abandonment of the McCarthy soon followed that of the Kennecott. And these two industry towns out in the wilderness became ghost towns. Even the railroad that transported the ore to a port nearly 200 miles away fell into despair, and the rail bed eventually became McCarthy Road. So McCarthy Road begins where the pavement ends, about 61 miles to the west. And in 1983, the road was covered with gravel, even though it's often scarred by washouts with washboard ruts. Even railroad ties through these floods will make their way to the surface and damage people's tires as well. 10 years before the event we're going to be speaking of happened, there was a flood that happened, and it washed out the bridge to the east of the road where it crossed the Kennecott River into McCarthy. Even though that the State Department of Transportation wanted to come in and build a footbridge to span the Kennecott, the local residents resisted that, and as a result, the only land route that they have to McCarthy in 1983 was to cross by means of a hand-powered tram that they built themselves. So Lewis Hastings, he had worked as a computer programmer at Stanford University, and in June of 1979, Hastings married his girlfriend at the time, Madeline D. Stovall. She was a librarian at Stanford as well. And during their honeymoon at the Kennecott Lodge near McCarthy, they decided then that they were going to quit their jobs in California and move to Alaska the following spring. So Lewis and his wife left California for Alaska in 1980. Initially, Lewis had fled the overdevelopment of California for the wilderness of Alaska. And instead, he found that the state was in throes of development, largely due to the opening of the Trans-Alaskan oil pipeline, which winds from Prudhoe Bay south to the port of Valdez on Prince William Sound. The 800-mile pipeline cost about $8 billion to build, renewed in the natural resource economy in Alaska, and now is responsible for transporting 25% of the total U.S. oil production. When he lived in California, Hastings had once volunteered to clean up oil-soaked birds following an offshore oil spill. He began to target the pipeline shortly after he arrived in Alaska. According to one psychiatric report, Hastings, quote, "He was disturbed by the population growth and influx of money into the state, and determined that the best way to interrupt this was to destroy the pipeline and thus cut off Alaska's wealth and consistent growth." End quote. So the destruction of the pipeline would be the end to his McCarthy rampage that he was planning. So it would begin when the weekly mail plane arrived. Hastings planned on killing everyone who showed up at the Hegland's place, and most of McCarthy's residents usually did. With most of the residents eliminated, Hastings would hijack the mail plane and kill the pilot. He then planned to land the plane near the pipeline at a pump station about 80 miles west of McCarthy, and rig the plane to take off again with no one at the controls. At that point, Hastings would commandeer a fuel truck and ram the pipeline while shooting at it. He theorized that the cold winter weather would congeal the oil in the broken pipeline, thus minimizing environmental damage spillage while disrupting the oil flow. The fuel truck would burst into flames, charring his body beyond recognition. Hastings thought that because the entire town would be dead and his body would be unrecognizable, he could destroy the pipeline, commit suicide, and not reveal to his family that he had been the murderer and a suicide. Officials would believe that he had died along with the rest of Kennecott and McCarthy at the hands of an unknown killer. To escape the influence of civilization, Hastings and his wife purchased an unoccupied house on the property of the Kennecott copper mine, about 5 miles from McCarthy, and spent the summer of 1982 repairing the building. By early 1983, His computer business that he started there began to falter, and due to the marital problems that he was having, his wife stayed in Anchorage most of the time as well. As a consequence of all this, Hastings started to elaborate this attack plan on the pipeline, which had come to his mind about a year earlier. He bought guns and at least 2,000 rounds of ammunition. He built a suppressor that he covered in beaver fur for a pistol that he wanted to use, and prepared for the murders by shooting a rabbit. He also compiled a list of 200 of Alaska's political and civil leaders, including the phone numbers and home addresses of the members of the Anchorage Police Department Crisis Intervention and Response Team. According to Hastings' own testimony, his plan comprised of extermination of all of the residents of McCarthy to wipe out all possible witnesses. He wanted to kill the mail plane pilot, use the aircraft to dump the bodies on the glaciers of the Wrangell Mountains, and then land on a highway and rig the plane to take off again, as said. The psychiatrist who examined him after his arrest doubted that Hastings ever made such a plan as this because of his inflated sense of self-worth would have prevented him from ever taking his own life. Hastings' public defender said at his psychiatric hearings, quote, "If you really distill it down, Mr. Hastings thought he was going to be the savior of the Alaskan wilderness." End quote. Even though Kennecott's population in 1983 was in the single digits, there was about 24 people that lived year-round within about a 50-mile radius of the neighboring McCarthy. Maxine Edwards and her husband Jim, both 52 at the time, they were homestead in a house that they built on the east side of Kennecott River in 1953. She was called Maxine the Diligent by a friend of hers. Edwards was described in 1983 as, quote, "a hard-working woman who could operate a bulldozer by afternoon and serve dinner on linen and crystal at night," end quote. So on March the 1st, 1983, Maxine Edwards crossed the frozen Kennecott River to visit the Heglands. Pulling a small plastic sled behind her, she lived less than 100 yards from the west end of the McCarthy airstrip, with a spruce forest on a bluff overlooking McCarthy. The Edwards were going to celebrate their 25th anniversary in 2 weeks. Les and Flo Hegland, Les at 64 years of age and Flo at 58. They lived in Alaska for about 27 years. In 1967, they had moved to McCarthy, where they had built an addition on their front porch and always left it unlocked so that the groceries delivered by the weekly mail plane would not freeze and their neighbors could come by at any time to pick their groceries up. Locals considered the Heglands to be the town of McCarthy's unofficial postmasters. The Heglands also made daily weather observations using a small meteorological site at their home. They radioed this information to the Federal Aviation Administration's flight service station in Cordova, Alaska. The Heglands' two-way radio was the only one in McCarthy that had enough power to contact the world outside of the national forest. Besides that, McCarthy was genuinely cut off from the rest of the outside world. Tim and Amy Nash. Tim was 38 and Amy was 25. They had gotten married outside of Alaska during the Christmas of 1982. Then they returned to Tim's nearly completed log cabin in McCarthy on Valentine's Day of 1983, only 2 weeks before March the 1st. A friend of theirs in McCarthy gave them a quarter of a moose and a mincemeat pie with a heart carved in it to celebrate the occasion. Tim, who had lived in McCarthy for 7 years, worked construction in Glen Allen, and following a divorce, he had been living alone in the cabin that he had been building with hand tools. He met Amy in the summer of 1982 when Amy ventured to McCarthy as a tourist. Harley King was 61 and his wife Jo. They had lived on the homestead 15 miles west of McCarthy off of McCarthy Road. Prior to his retirement, Harley King served as a commercial fisherman out of Cordova, and he was a hunting guide. In the 1950s, he hunted wolves in a predator control program alongside another guide, Jay Hammond, who later became the governor of Alaska. On the morning of March the 1st, 1983, Harley King gave Donna Brehm, Donna 32 years of age, he gave her a ride on his snowmobile to the McCarthy airstrip. Brehm, who lived off of McCarthy Road also, between the King's home and the town of McCarthy, she was planning to fly out on the mail plane. Chris Richards, he was 29 at the time. He worked in summer construction and then collected unemployment insurance and food stamps during the winter. He was at home and he was preparing his breakfast using no modern appliances. In 1983, McCarthy had no running water, no telephones, and no electricity, except for that was produced by individual generators. McCarthy is not a place that someone just stumbled into living there. These pioneers that lived there made conscious decisions to go there and live there in isolation and under extreme conditions. Yet, despite their fierce independence and self-reliance, the citizens of McCarthy formed close bonds. And on Tuesdays, they all gathered at the Hegland's home, so they would socialize and wait for the weekly plane to come flying in and deliver their mail. Tuesdays were weekly events, and often it was the only chance that these neighbors actually got together to see each other. So on March the 1st, 1983, that fell on a Tuesday. And that Tuesday was the Tuesday that Lewis Hastings was going to attempt to murder the city of McCarthy, Alaska. And by 2 p.m. of that day, 6 of McCarthy's dozen or so year-round residents would be lying dead and 2 more wounded. One of them would be cowered in a greenhouse, tightly holding her upper right arm to prevent the flow of blood that was coming out. While she was cowered down and stifling the sound of her panicked breathing, the other injured had been flown by a neighbor to Glen Allen, a town 100 miles northwest and home of the nearest hospital, to receive treatment for a gunshot wound to his face and head. The 39-year-old Hastings was headed west on the lone road connecting McCarthy to the outside world. He rode a snowmobile that was taken from one of his victims. Each of the dead had received multiple gunshot wounds, including at least one single wound to the head. After killing McCarthy's residents, Lewis planned on sabotaging the Alaska pipeline, but the plot began to unravel. However, after Lewis's nearest neighbor survived 2 gunshot wounds to his head and escaped to warn others. The previous night, Lewis had played board games with Chris Richards in Kennecott, a town of 4 about 5 miles north of McCarthy. Hastings won his game that night, and during the course of the conversation while playing, Richards had mentioned that a couple of McCarthy's residents were away on a skiing trip. Lewis seemed very disappointed about receiving this information. Richards also warned Hastings about cutting some firewood from dead trees on land that had been subdivided recently and might be off limits to such activity. Richards said in a 1983 newspaper interview, quote, "He seemed to appreciate the fact that I was concerned about him," end quote. The next morning at about 8:30, Chris saw Lewis approaching the front door of his home from the south side. He thought that Hastings was stopping by on his way to go pick up the mail. Richards pushed the door ajar and invited Lewis in for coffee. Lewis sat down a heavy backpack, and before entering, he took a deep breath. Chris turned his back to the door and he faced the stove to continue preparing breakfast. And then, as he begun to turn his head to greet Lewis. He felt something strike his right cheek, something that shattered his glasses. He ducked his head instinctively, and then he felt something hit the top of his head. He spun around to see Lewis approaching with a rifle. Chris and Lewis began to struggle. Chris screamed at Lewis to stop, and Lewis replied, quote, "Look, you're already dead. If you'll just quit fighting, I'll make this easy for you." End quote. Chris grabbed a knife from the drain board of his sink, and he stabbed Lewis one time in the upper left chest, slightly wounding him, and then once in the right leg. Chris then escaped into the waist-deep snow, only wearing socks, one slipper, a t-shirt, and some corduroy pants. He scrambled 3/4 of a mile up a steep hill to a neighbor's unoccupied cabin. Lewis fired several shots at Chris as he was fleeing, nicking his right arm. At the cabin, Chris got some boots, a parka, and snowshoes, and from there he stumbled about 1/10 of a mile southwest to the newlyweds' cabin, which was situated on the trail connecting Kennecott to McCarthy. At the cabin, as the Nashes attended to his wounds, Chris told them at what had happened. The Nashes said that they had seen Hastings heading towards McCarthy about 20 minutes earlier. Chris then insisted that they arm themselves and they get to the runway to warn the others, who were sure to be congregating there, waiting for the mail plane. The Nashes jumped on and rode their snowmobile, pulling Chris behind them in the sled. They went to the airstrip. At the north end of the airstrip, they met Gary Green, a local pilot and a guide who was cleaning snow off of his plane. Green said that he, too, had seen Hastings about 20 minutes earlier, heading towards the Headlands. The Nashes and Green decided that Tim Nash would go check the Headlands while Green warmed up his plane to fly Chris to Glen Allen. It's about a 45-minute flight away. After warming his engine up, Green taxied to the end of the runway to load Chris onto his plane. Amy Nash then noticed her husband running down the strip approaching them. Green got out of his plane and met Tim Nash on the runway. Tim told Green he had just been to the Headlands. There, Tim had smelled a heavy concentration of gun smoke. He saw blood all over the inside of the house. Tim thought that the Headlands were dead and noticed that someone had attempted to clean up blood in the Headlands kitchen. While Tim was standing in the kitchen, he saw Hastings on the back porch. Nash fired a shotgun blast at Hastings that struck a door jamb, and Hastings returned fire, striking Tim in the right leg. Green and the Nashes decided that the Nashes would remain to warn others away from the airstrip, while Green took off with Chris to get him help. As Green lifted off, he saw Tim and Amy Nash walking towards each other on the east side of the runway, on his way to Glen Allen, with Richards bleeding in the back seat. Green contacted the incoming mail plane that was scheduled to land at 11 a.m. He told the pilot not to land in McCarthy. Then he radioed the state police in Glen Allen. In the meantime, Lewis was backtracked towards the airstrip along a dog sled trail. The trail snaked through dense bush behind a large mound of plowed snow across the runway from the Nashes. Hastings crawled atop of the mound, and after Glenn took off, he fired at least 10 rounds at the Nashes about 250 yards away from him. The Nashes fell. Lewis walked within 50 feet of their prone bodies and fired 2 more shots. He continued to approach the Nashes. Then he fired more shots from close range into their heads. Lewis then dragged the Nashes to the top of the snowbank opposite his sniping location, just to hide them in the deeper snow. At about that time, Harley King and Donna Byram arrived at the north end of the airstrip on King's snowmobile. Byram saw Lewis walking over the snowbank on the west side of the airstrip. Then she saw blood in the snow on the east side. She wondered who would be butchering animals on the runway. As they drew closer to the Nash's bodies, Lewis started firing at them. Byram, who was standing on a sled that trailed the snowmobile, saw bullets hit King. One bullet hit Byram in her upper right arm. King then accelerated the snowmobile as more bullets hit it. They were traveling south now, away from Lewis. But King lost control of the snowmobile. His leg had been broken by one of Lewis's shots. The snowmobile threw King and Byram onto the runway near a path that led from the airstrip to the headlands. As Byram attempted to load King back onto the snowmobile, Lewis was approaching from about 100 yards away from him. Byram froze. King then told Byram that he couldn't move and that she should save herself and go. Byram hurried towards the Headlands' home. As she entered the spruce woods, she heard Lewis shoot King twice. When Byram got into the Headlands, she noticed that the door had been kicked in, and she was afraid to enter. So she then hid outside the Headlands' greenhouse. After Lewis killed King, he began to look for Byram. He approached the Headlands' house, calling out, quote, "One not dead, one not dead," end quote. Byram cowered inside the nearby greenhouse, tightly gripping her injured arm. All she heard was Lewis's footsteps on the Headlands' porch and the wind whipping against the side of the greenhouse. Lewis then abruptly ended his search for Byram, and he sped off on the Nash's snowmobile. Lewis thought the police would be responding in a fixed-wing aircraft, if that. So if he got away from the airstrip, he would be safe. However, the first state troopers to respond left Glen Allen in an unmarked helicopter. As they got there, they saw Lewis heading west on the snow-covered McCarthy Road. When the state troopers landed, Lewis waved and offered no resistance. He said that he was Chris Richards and that Lou Hastings had gone berserk and he was, quote, "shooting up McCarthy," end quote. The state troopers knew that Richards was already in Glen Allen, receiving treatment for his wounds. They also already had a description of Lewis. Based on the fact that Richards was already in Glen Allen receiving treatment and the descriptions of Lewis that they had already had, the state troopers went ahead and arrested Hastings right then and there. They then flew to McCarthy to search for survivors. At that point, Hastings told the troopers, quote, "I'm your man," end quote. Outside of the greenhouse, the police found Byram. She shared the 40-minute helicopter ride to Glen Allen with the police and with Lewis. Inside the Headlands house, the police found Les and Flo Hegland and Maxine Edwards stacked into the bedroom like cordwood. And according to one state trooper, they also found several spent cartridges in the kitchen and in the back porch area. A bloody, fur-covered suppressor sat on the nightstand next to the bodies. Quote, "There was a lot of shooting that went on inside that house. There were a lot of bullets sprayed around," end quote, said by one state trooper. On March the 15th, a resident who was out of town when the murders occurred filled out a police report. And part of it read, quote, "In the winter, my exposure to Hastings was limited to mail days, when most everyone got together and at the home of Chris Richards, where the three of us would play cards and talk. My general impression of these meetings was that he was quiet and reserved, not going out of his way to socialize, and seemed to want to be left alone for the most part. Talking about science and technology, the world situation, the future of Kennecott, I felt he was certainly intelligent and fairly knowledgeable on these topics, but disillusioned and down on society in general. He seemed not too well prepared in skills or supplies to live out in the Kennecott area, and it seemed a bit odd for him to come and go as he did and from Anchorage. In general, people are accepted in spite of any differences by the others in the McCarthy and Kennecott area, and live and let live attitude seems to prevail. So much of what I mentioned here did not seem unlike things that could be noticed in others living out here. End quote. Lloyd Green, a McCarthy area resident since the 1960s, considered Hastings' clothing strange, but in a 1997 interview, he recalls a conversation with Gary Green, the local bush pilot. He's unrelated to Lloyd. The Greens were standing on McCarthy Path when Hastings approached. Lloyd said, quote, "You know that Lou? He's kind of strange," end quote. Gary answered, quote, "Well, so are you." "We all are. So what?" End quote. Lloyd echoes that two-word refrain and implies it, quote, "Everyone here is a little strange in their own way." So, okay, here's just another strange guy, and he's not doing anything. He's antisocial. But we're not tremendously social anyways. And so we really don't pay too much attention. So Lou's strange. So what? End quote. But then Hastings killed 6 of Lloyd Green's friends and neighbors. At that time, Lloyd had been up McCarthy Creek at his remote winter cabin. He heard about the murders over his portable radio. Green said, quote, "It wasn't necessarily a surprise. However, Hastings wasn't the one that I thought it probably was." End quote. He didn't elaborate any more on that. Jim Miller had left McCarthy a few weeks before the murders. He too first heard about the murders on the radio while he was driving to work. Quote, I kind of figured it might have happened. I don't know. If anybody was going to do it, I figured it might have been Hastings, being a loner anyway, but at first, it was kind of a shock. I suspected 3 or 4 different people, but, end quote. Miller didn't elaborate any further than that either. Given the fact that Hastings wanted to stem Alaskan development, his McCarthy target also seemed to surprise both investigators and townspeople, but clouded by his desperation and urged on his suicidal tendencies, Hastings lacked clarity and patience. He failed to truly see McCarthy and Alaska in general, and acted on these misconceptions. If Hastings had been paying attention, he would have seen the irony in killing a town where the residents knew each other by their boot tracks. A town that existed with no electricity, no running water, no telephones. To protest what he even perceived to be a over-industrialization of Alaska. Hastings' prosecutor said in a 1983 newspaper article, quote, "In the name of Alaska, he destroyed part of Alaska and the Alaskan life, a place where the spirit of Alaska lives on. The irony is that he comes up from an overpopulated California, moves into the midst of such beauty, and then in order to protect the beauty, he single-handedly wipes out a whole town." End quote. Bonnie Morris said in 1983 as she stood near the body bags of her neighbors, quote, "A nobody came in here and wiped out the pillars of one of the few self-sufficient communities in Alaska. These people lying around here were not your average people. These are the people who inspired the rest of us when we came here to build a sane, healthy life." End quote. 15 years later, as McCarthy struggles to control its tourist industry, old-time residents still grapple with the effects of the murders. Quote, "This ain't Chicago," end quote, is what Chris Richards says on an August morning in 1997. Richards sits at a picnic table on the porch of a McCarthy pizza place. Quote, "It's not New York. We're not anonymous. Even the neighbors, I don't necessarily get along with all the time, but they're precious to me. Here, it was a major, devastating impact. If somebody killed 50% of New York or Chicago, they'd declare nuclear war over that. I mean, it would mean the end of the world. And the equivalent of that happened here. It wiped out our elders. Or most of them. It wiped out half of the community." End quote. It's a community that now finds itself changing, despite or perhaps because of its remoteness. All the old friendships are tested by all the new developments going on there. Al joins Jim Miller. He's the owner of the pizza place, and Richards. At 61 years old, Al has spent 33 years in the McCarthy area and is one of the few remaining town elders from 1983. He said, quote, "I'm out here at the end of the trail because I'm an outlaw," end quote. Jim Miller also said with a knowing grin, quote, "Al talks about everything. Water, sewer, putting in electricity. Al's always got 40 scams going on at once," end quote. Richards has told a story of the murders about a dozen times. He considers it therapeutic. He says that as the years of telling it has slipped by, it becomes easier to tell. He no longer grits his teeth and feels the adrenaline rush. Strangers who look for the scars and they ask, what's it like getting shot in the face by your nearest neighbor in a ghost town? But those who Hastings killed, it still pains Richards, who now flies a skull and crossbones flag outside of his cabin. As he recounts his near-death struggle, he maintains his composure and sense of humor, but he breaks down when he thinks of those who was murdered, particularly the Heglins. Richard said with watery eyes, quote, "I've got nothing but total respect for them. They're old-timers. They were all here before I even thought about coming here. They had been there, done that. Had a successful homestead, raised healthy kids. All I could say is good stuff about them. I mean, they were the original item as far as people living back here. They were the original pirates, even if they didn't consider themselves that. None of those people ever had a harsh word to say to me. They were good people. They lived a good life. We can't even afford to waste them. Too precious. Lewis got rid of a whole bunch of them all at once right there. And I would think a lot of people remember them and respect them. They were the good people. They took a major chunk out of this place. It changed the way that it will be, no doubt, forever." End quote. Not only did Lewis kill a large portion of the town elders that day, he nearly killed the most important day in McCarthy, and that was Mail Day. Every Tuesday, the Heglins' place was where the distant neighbors congregated, shared news from the outside, and exchanged gossip over tea and coffee. A state trooper who helped arrest Hastings said in a 1997 interview, quote, "See, Tuesday is mail plane day. You can have Easter, you can have Thanksgiving, you can have Christmas, but it's not as important as Tuesday. Everybody meets the Heglins' house to visit and get the mail. Mail plane day. I mean, you live for that. It's correspondence. I check my mailbox every day. They got mail once a week and made contact." End quote. People in McCarthy still conversationally refer to Mail Day simply as mail, like it's a place or an event. They still say, "I'm going to mail. Do you have anything going out that you want me to take?" But mail is no longer the event that it was when the Heglins hosted it. The townspeople now gather on the gravel airstrip outside the small mail shack. Since the shack is a simple wooden structure about 10 feet by 10 feet, neighbors now quickly sort the mail then mill about the airstrip. And in the summer, some of them worked their way down to McCarthy, about a mile away, to congregate at Miller's Pizza Place. From Miller's porch, Richards recalls how it used to be. Quote, "We'd sit around, have tea and cookies it was. You know, the big social event of the week. And everybody from miles around that could get there would usually be there. They'd swap their bullshit, and they'd get their mail, and they'd leave. It was a good time. I miss it. It's not the same anymore. It's not the same at all." End quote. Almost all of them can remember something that they now feel that should have clued them in to Hastings' murderous intentions. Loy Green, who no longer greets the mail plane, thinks back on the times that he made what he thought were benign comments, only to have Hastings glower at him, his lip twitching. Green said, quote, "So after he did his number, I'm thinking, oh my God, I saw something in that man. I definitely saw something. But I wrote it off as just, so what? And right then I said to myself, okay, if I ever see that in another person's eyes, I'm not going to stand idle, period. I'm not going to say, oh well, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm going to do something. I don't know what, but something." End quote. A few years later, a couple of fundamentalist Christians had temporarily moved to McCarthy and were hoping to make their stay permanent. Green engaged one in a religious debate. Green said, quote, "I saw the same look, the same lip curl, and he walked away." End quote. Green reported this to the proprietor of the McCarthy Lodge, who had been helping the two men get started. And when he heard Green's story, he said, quote, "Okay, those guys are out of here. No support, no land." End quote. Chris Richards carried a handgun around in his back pocket for 8 years after the murders. The only time he didn't have it on him was when he slept. He said, quote, "It was like I was afraid for myself. It was more or less, I owe this to my neighbors. I can't lose any more of my friends and neighbors. Even the ones that I don't like. They're my neighbors. Excuse me, I don't need any other assholes coming around and shooting them. They're precious to me. I think of them more of a big tribe of people. Most of us live here because we love this place. And we have that much in common." End quote. For weeks, McCarthy's survivors devoted nearly every conversation to the murders, and at least indirectly how to redefine their community. And for weeks they nearly sleptwalked around daily reminders of the murders. Bloodstains soaked deep into the snow. Impromptu meetings were held. Options were considered. One person even said, quote, "We can't trust anybody that comes here anymore." End quote. Another would counter, quote, "Wait a minute, if we do that on a larger sense, lose the winner then." End quote. Loy Green said, quote, "If we don't trust anybody, if everybody who comes in is a suspect, then we're putting out negative energy and we're creating a suspicious atmosphere, and then we can't expect to have people here. Better if we open our arms now to everybody. But have a little caution." End quote. The old trams became the natural focus. Their cables snagged dangerously close to the Kennecott River, and they were difficult to use. The locals had a plan for a new tram prior to the murders because they feared that the state would build an automotive bridge that would threaten McCartney's isolation. At that time, Loy Green said, quote, "If you could drive to McCarthy, it wouldn't be here." End quote. After Hastings' murders, however, the tram took on a new meaning and a heightened sense of urgency. The community got together and they secured $90,000 from the state. Residents cut logs for support towers and salvaged unused cables from the mines. Because of our lives on the Alaskan frontier, we are all handy with tools. Jim Edwards, Maxine's widower, designed the tram car. A state-hired foreman quit because no one would follow his orders. Within 2 summer months, the new trams were completed. Green said, quote, "We felt like a community that has accomplished something and was together. That was a healing. You bet it was." End quote. But the new trams helped slowly increase tourist traffic. Then in 1997, the state built a pair of multi-million-dollar footbridges in preparation for a surge of tourism. In the last decade, several businesses have opened up: Miller's Pizza Place, 2 air services, 2 guide services, a coffee shop, and an upscale lodge, to name a few. With this increased development, political and business bickering has increased. Among longtime neighbors, Lewis Hastings, who is currently serving a 634-year sentence at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. He wouldn't recognize the town that he tried to kill en route to stalling the Alaskan development. While local differences seem to occur more often than in 1983, none resonate like the murders. Old-timers simply remind themselves of March the 1st, 1983, for a dose of perspective. The victims of that day were Maxine Edwards at 52 years old, Flo Heglin at 58, Les Heglin at 64, Harley King at 61, Amy Nash at 25, Tim Nash at 38. Donna Byram, 32, was injured, shot in the right arm, and Christopher Richards, 29, was shot in the eye, the head, and the arm. He was wounded as well and survived. So Lewis Hastings was tried in 1984 for 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He pled no contest. Hastings was sentenced on July the 27th of 1984 to 6 69-year terms for the first-degree murder convictions and 2 20-year terms for the attempted murder convictions. All terms were to be served consecutively, and Hastings appealed, claimed that he was temporarily insane due to the inhalation of organic copper. That was dismissed. As of 1998, he was held at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, currently held at Spring Creek Correctional Facility. And with that, everyone, concludes tonight's tale. I wanted to try a not-so-known case, so this is the one that I found to try out first. I'd love to hear y'all's feedback on it. Did y'all like this story? Would y'all like to hear more of lesser-known cases that I can find? Let me know what you think. And everybody, as always, I appreciate you being here. Appreciate your support. Please remember to like, subscribe. That's it till next time. And as always, remember, someone will be taking the mail plane, and it doesn't have to be you. Good night, everyone.